Let me just see if I can get the tech working. So morning everyone, my name's Ed James, Director of Procurement at Humber and North Yorkshire Procurement Collaborative. We are a group of 3 acute trusts, so that's Hull University Teaching Hospitals, York and Scarborough, and Northern Lincolnshire and Gaul. What we've done is put a single procurement function in across the 3 trusts. So Rob's kindly given me the title to talk about the future value of NHS procurement in light of the appointment of a new Director General who'll be looking at commercial and growth. I think this is particularly difficult to cover in this session because we don't actually know who has that post yet and what their priorities, values and ambitions are going to be when they get into that post. We can assume we know what some of them are from the political sort of noise that we hear at the moment, but will that focus around value is something we will have to wait and see. So I wanted to start with a bit of an introduction and context. It does feel like we're at a bit of a crossroads in terms of NHS procurement. I think interestingly this session is titled The Future Value of NHS Procurement, but then that subcategory sort of talks about growth and commercial. And that's what that new Director General's title is going to be, and they'll be the head of profession for sort of NHS procurement. And I think it's worth reflecting on the fact that we have a bit of an identity crisis probably in procurement, that we go with the name of sort of supplies, purchasing, procurement and commercial. So trying to sell a vision and a strategy in one place is quite tricky to do. Also for the sort of 4,000 staff who work in NHS procurement, having that link back up to a Director General for growth and commercial when their job title may have nothing to do with that will also be quite tricky. So I think professionalisation of the function is key. The previous Chief Commercial Officer that we had, who was Head of Profession, quoted 4,000 staff in NHS procurement, half of which work to get goods that are delivered into the hospital from the back door to the point of use and to order in clinical areas using inventory management systems. We know from our corporate services return in NHS that procurement is one of the lowest funded corporate functions in the organisation per 100 million of trust income. And this is for a function who deliver a return on investment somewhere between 3 to 1 and 5 to 1 for their organisations. So that's important because actually what we are doing is we're driving behaviours locally to focus on cost and not value. And then that makes that quite complicated when you listen to what David's talking about around value-based, to change the behaviours locally to consider cost, to consider value. And just to build on that, I mean, for my area, we've got a bit of a tough financial position where we are focusing purely on reducing costs. So locally, I've got a cost improvement plan of 50 million that we need to deliver by the end of March 26. We're looking at a further 150 million by the end of March 27. So that's where we get quite heavily focused onto cost and not value. We've also got quite well sort of tested methodologies for calculating what does value mean and cost mean, and as David put on the screen, that sort of balance in the evaluation criteria. We've done that quite well for what does it mean in terms of cost. What we haven't done quite so well is how do we determine what value is, how do we monetize that, and how do we present that back internally. And putting some of those sort of this is how we are going to define what value is into a tender document can be quite difficult to explain to people, quite difficult to calculate, and from a procurement perspective gets us quite nervous that we could be leaving ourselves open to challenge. So we do need to do some work around defining what we mean by value, how we monetize that value, and then how do we look at sort of comparing value to cost. So what I mean by that is if I take value-based procurement and we buy something that reduces a patient's length of stay in the hospital, we can release a bed day. But from my finance team's perspective, releasing one bed day doesn't deliver any savings, because unless you close enough beds to close a bed bay or a ward, you still have the overhead of that whole area to keep it open. So we need to close enough beds to release that. Also, the way in which NHS financing works plays into that and makes it quite complicated. So we're still in quite a lot of what is known as block contracts. So if we see 100 patients, we'll get paid what's agreed in the block. If we see 200 patients, we still get that sort of block payment. We don't get any other further funding for treating more patients. The other bit that I think that we need to have a think about is around behavioural change and objective setting. So procurement staff, when you look at their objectives, will quite often have an objective around savings. Because we haven't yet worked out how to quantify and monetize value, you tend not to see anything in the set of objectives around delivery of value. So if we can change that sort of the way we set objectives for our staff, that should help deliver the value agenda. And I think most importantly, we need to remember that procurement doesn't act in a silo. And I'm still very grateful that Rob sort of termed that I am the magic wand, locally, I guess. But actually what procurement does is bring together a group of stakeholders. So it's my clinical leads who look at what is that medtech, what is the product that we want to buy, is it going to work for the patient? It's the finance staff who come together to look at what is the cost versus value. And what procurement do is we sort of guide those stakeholders to make an informed decision. I mean, quite often it's difficult because my stakeholders who make those informed decisions are hugely busy. They're clearing waiting lists. They're getting people out the door as quickly as possible. They're getting sort of ambulance wait times reduced, and they're also covering staff strikes and sickness as well. So we end up being pressured into buying what we can buy as quickly as we can buy and not necessarily taking account and getting enough time in the process to do what we want to do. So I think the other bit that we need to consider is that sort of change in what do we mean by specification. So having worked in the NHS for a while, we're very good at going into the drawer, getting out a spec that we used 3 to 5 years ago and going, yeah, that'll do, we'll put that back out to market. We don't tend to take time to incorporate, well, what are the latest changes in the market? Or actually, how do we want to influence where that market goes? And what I'd quite like to see in the future is, could we move away from specifying the solution to actually just explaining the problem and letting the market come to us to explain perhaps the bits that we don't know as to how they can help and support us. The other bit I wanted to reflect on is, as a sort of procurement function, we operate in quite a heavy sort of system of controls, whether that be local, regional or national controls. There are some really good statements in the 10-year plan around making that process easier, but we've also sort of had some other guidance from the medium-term planning framework, which does make it clear we only get some of those sort of finance flexibilities of multi-year financial planning if we work in an ICB. If we work in an ICB which has either break-even or has delivered a surplus, and as I say, next year 150 million to get to break-even, and a projection of probably 3 to 5 years away before we can even get there. So it's not sort of all doom and gloom, but I did want to share a bit of a case study from some of the frustrations that we hear back from our suppliers. And I've done quite a lot of work with the University of York on something called Enterprise Works, where they bring together local VCSEs and SMEs to meet with anchor institutes. And I recently ended up talking to a gentleman called Graham, who agreed that I could share this with you all today. So Graham set up a not-for-profit company 3 years ago called Procurement. The organisation looks to support the NHS and local authority with early identification and intervention around prescribed medicine and alcohol. What they do is they pull data to look at where does the risk sit with individuals to predict those who might then turn to prescribed drugs or alcohol and become dependent upon it. So they look to stop patients entering the system before they do, which will then reduce costs to the NHS. Nationally, there's around 3.2 million adults in England who are prescribed medicines and associated with dependence or withdrawal. One of those is opioids, and hospital admissions linked to opioid use has increased since 2015, despite a reduction in prescribing. So Graham did some work with the Life Chances Fund and managed to secure nearly £200,000 per annum over 5 years to help fund deploying that technology. He went through a bit of a process with Cabinet Office approvals, the big lottery fund approvals, and then hit sort of sign-off with the local clinical commissioning group. He says that there was no risk to the local clinical commissioning group in investing in this. The funding was being provided centrally, the risk was taken centrally. So I asked Graham to sort of reflect on, well, what went wrong and what could have happened better? And Graham's reflection was that the project didn't proceed because between the NHS and the local authority, no one could work out where does the benefit sit, and therefore who picked up the cost versus who took the benefit. One budget on the local authority side would have the cost, the NHS would take the benefit. So the purpose for sort of raising this one is twofold. Firstly, I wanted to highlight, I think we quite often say procurement is an issue for people to sell into the NHS. And I think in this instance, it isn't procurement, it's a funding flow and it's a governance structure. This hadn't even got to the stage of procurement yet. And the second point is we see this behaviour daily, especially working across 3 trusts, where actually what we might see is the benefit from value-based procurement sitting in one budget line, whereas the cost sits in another. And because of the way in which budgets are split across organisations, it makes it very difficult. So in terms of the future and what could positivity be, NHS procurement could certainly do more, and David's outlined the work that the Department of Health are undertaking at the moment. But I think we need to stop referring to procurement in isolation. We know locally that our experts are busy and stretched, and we know that we could do more. What would really help is centrally, to help accelerate things, is some sort of central guidance and documentation and templates that we could use locally. I think we need to move away from what I would call the policy grenade of, we have a policy that we've developed centrally, we throw it out to 200 different NHS trusts and hope that they all deploy it in the same way. We need to come out with that guidance, help, support and hand-holding. The other bit that I think is really key is we often miss talking about the how. We're very good at talking about the what, but we don't say how we're going to do something or who's going to do it. And I know that the Department of Health are quite scared around the word mandate, but actually guidance, templates and sharing best practice isn't a mandate, it drives us in the right direction. We do need to look at digitisation. We spend a lot of time in the NHS doing admin tasks that we could digitise. We do need to make the most of artificial intelligence and how that could help us. And hopefully our new Director General comes in to have a look at what is that digital strategy around commercial and how can we take the noise away. There was a great LinkedIn story over the weekend by someone saying that actually procurement can't get strategic under the new Procurement Act because of the number of transparency notices and administration that we need to do. Likewise, we should be able to use our data to support contract management and value creation. Another nervousness of mine around sort of that cost versus value, if a supplier says that their product or service delivers value to the organisation in 2 to 3 years' time, what happens if that value is not being created and can't be justified? So we need very strong contract management to be able to track that. We also need to make the most of our sort of NHS Crown reps to make sure they're identifying trends, risks, and how we move into the space of strategic supply management. So we've got some time for questions. I'll move on to in summary. So as I say, I think what we need to address this is some sort of greater help and support from the centre to deliver the sort of how and the who. We can't leave it to 200 trusts to sort of review and implement national policy locally and expect and hope for it to be successful. So my ask, I guess, to David is clear. Don't just justify what you want us to do, but grab the bull by the horns, give us all of the support that we need to deliver that locally across sort of 4,000 different staff, and to make, at the end of the day, the sort of experience for my end users who are clinicians as easy as possible to engage with procurement. So I'll finish there and let us move on to questions.